You know what's strange about history? We spend most of our time learning about kings and emperors and generals, people who actively wanted to be remembered. They built monuments with their names carved 50 feet high, commissioned official histories, basically shouted, "Remember me," into the void of time. And we did remember them, which is exactly what they wanted. But tonight, we're going to ignore all of those people completely, because the most fascinating voices from the past are the ones that were never supposed to reach us at all. I'm talking about the grocery lists scratched onto broken pottery, the angry letters between brothers who couldn't stand each other, the desperate curse tablets buried in wells asking the gods to punish someone who stole a cloak, the worried note from a mother to her soldier son telling him to wear warm socks. Real people, regular people, people who would be absolutely mortified to know that 2,000 years later, someone would be reading their private correspondence on a podcast before bed. These weren't meant for us. They were meant for one person, or maybe for the gods, or for nobody at all. And yet here they are, speaking across millennia, telling us things that no official history ever could. Tonight we're going to read other people's mail from the ancient world. And honestly, they'd probably be furious about it. But they're not here to complain, so let's begin. Before we dive deeper into these impossibly personal voices from the past, if you're finding comfort in this quiet journey through time, a like or subscription helps keep these gentle explorations going. And if you know someone else who'd enjoy drifting off to ancient whispers and forgotten conversations, share this with them too. Now, let's read some very old mail that was absolutely none of our business. There's a letter that survived from Roman Britain, written sometime around the year 100, that might be the most achingly ordinary thing you'll ever encounter from the ancient world. It's an invitation to a birthday party. That's it. No grand historical significance, no mention of emperors or battles, just one woman inviting another woman to celebrate her birthday. The letter was found at Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern England. It was written on a thin wooden tablet, the kind Romans used for everyday correspondence before tossing them away. The writer was Claudia Severa, the wife of a Roman military commander. She was writing to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, inviting her to come celebrate on the third day before the Ides of September, which means September 11th to those of us who don't naturally think in Roman calendar terms. What makes this letter extraordinary isn't what it says, really. It's that it existed at all, and that it somehow survived. Claudia Severa was living at the absolute edge of the Roman Empire in a cold, wet, thoroughly unpleasant posting in northern Britain. She was far from home, surrounded by military families in a frontier garrison, and she was maintaining the social rituals that made life bearable. Birthday parties, friendship, the small ceremonies that remind us we're human. The letter is touching in its formality mixed with genuine warmth. The main body was written by a scribe, which was common, but at the end, Claudia Severa added a few lines in her own hand. "I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail." Her handwriting is different from the scribe's, less practiced, more personal. You can almost feel her taking the stylus herself, wanting her friend to know this really mattered to her. That "my dearest soul" part, written in her own hand, is considered the earliest known example of writing in Latin by a woman, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. The thing that gets me about this letter is how much it wasn't supposed to survive. Claudia Severa wrote it. It was probably delivered by a messenger who rode through the British countryside. Sulpicia Lepidina read it, and then what? Maybe she kept it for a bit, maybe she threw it away. Either way, it ended up in the trash heaps of Vindolanda, where the wet, oxygen-poor conditions happen to preserve wood and leather and organic materials that normally rot away to nothing.
thousands of years later, archaeologists pulled it from the ground, and suddenly we know that on September 11th in the year 100 or so, two women who missed each other were making plans to celebrate together on the edge of the known world. That feels impossibly intimate, doesn't it? Like reading someone's text messages from 2 millennia ago.
While we're at Vindolanda, we should talk about the other letters found there, because honestly, the whole collection is like stumbling into an ancient military base's lost and found box, mixed with their private correspondence. One of the most famous letters from this collection is from a soldier named Octavius to his friend or commander Candidus, and it's basically a shopping list mixed with a guilt trip. Octavius writes to say he sent Candidus some things, and he's really hoping Candidus will send money back because he's completely broke. He mentions that he's used up his savings just to buy food and provisions. Then he asks, rather desperately, if Candidus could please send him some socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. That's the actual request: socks and underwear, from a Roman soldier stationed in Britain, which, if you've ever been to northern England, you'll know gets absolutely miserably cold and damp. The letter shows us something no grand military history would ever tell us. The Roman army conquered most of the known world, sure, but the individual soldiers were cold and broke and just wanted dry socks. They weren't thinking about glory or the expansion of Roman civilization. They were thinking about their feet. What's particularly touching is that Octavius clearly has an existing relationship with Candidus. He's not just placing an order, he's reaching out to someone he trusts, someone who might actually help him. The tone is both businesslike and personal. There's a certain dignity in the way he explains his situation without quite begging, though you can sense the desperation underneath. He's a professional soldier doing his job at the edge of empire, and he just needs some basic supplies to get through the British winter. These Vindolanda tablets were never meant to be permanent records. They were everyday communications, dashed off and discarded. The Romans had plenty of important documents they intended to preserve, carved in stone or carefully archived. But these wooden tablets were temporary, disposable, the ancient equivalent of memo pads or sticky notes, which means they're unfiltered. Nobody was performing for history when they wrote these. They were just communicating with each other, human to human, about the mundane necessities of life. And paradoxically, that's exactly what makes them so valuable to us now.
Let's talk about curse tablets, because they're wonderfully petty and reveal exactly what made ordinary people in the ancient world absolutely furious. A curse tablet, for those unfamiliar with the concept, was typically a small piece of lead or other soft metal that someone would inscribe with a curse or request to the gods or underworld deities, asking them to punish someone or rectify an injustice. Then you'd roll it up, sometimes fold it, maybe pierce it with a nail for extra effect, and deposit it somewhere sacred or spooky. Wells were popular, so were graves and temples dedicated to underworld gods. These were never meant to be found by living humans. They were messages to divine powers, which means people were startlingly honest about their grievances. And their grievances were often magnificently trivial by modern standards, which makes them absolutely fascinating. At the Roman baths in Bath, England, archaeologists have found over 100 curse tablets thrown into the sacred spring. Many of them deal with theft, which makes sense, given that public baths required people to undress and leave their belongings in changing rooms. The thieves must have had a field day. One curse tablet reads, "Silenus, to the goddess Sulis Minerva, I give to your divinity and majesty my bathing tunic and cloak. Do not allow sleep or health to him who has done me wrong, whether man or woman, or whether slave or free, unless he reveals himself and brings those goods to your temple." The writer, Silenus, had his clothes stolen while bathing. He's so angry that he's asking the goddess to deny the thief sleep and health until they return the stolen items. Not kill them, mind you, just make them really uncomfortable and tired until they confess. There's something almost reasonable about it in a completely unreasonable sort of way. And the fact that he specifies whether man or woman, or whether slave or free, shows he genuinely has no idea who took his stuff and wants to cover all possibilities.
Another curse tablet from Bath involves someone named Doxilianus who had 6 silver coins stolen. He writes, "Doxilianus, to the most holy goddess Sulis, I curse him who has stolen my hooded cloak, whether man or woman, whether slave or free, whether boy or girl, and I ask the goddess to allow him no health until he brings my hooded cloak to the temple of her divinity." Again with the hooded cloak. These garments were expensive, and losing one meant real financial loss. The curse is specific, legalistic even, making sure to cover every possible category of person who might have committed the theft. What I love about these curse tablets is how they bypass the official justice system entirely. If you were a regular person in Roman Britain and someone wronged you, what were your actual options? Taking legal action was expensive and complicated. You might not even know who wronged you. So instead, you appealed to a higher power, wrote your complaint on a piece of lead, and tossed it into sacred waters, trusting that divine justice would handle what human justice could not. It's a combination of faith, frustration, and a very practical approach to problem solving. These tablets also reveal the social dynamics of ancient communities: slaves cursing their masters, workers cursing their employers, spurned lovers cursing the objects of their affection. Someone at Bath cursed a person named Annianus, asking that the goddess make him unable to speak, unable to sleep, and basically miserable in every way until he confessed to some unnamed wrongdoing. The level of detail in these curses suggests people put real thought into them. This wasn't casual, this was serious business.
The ancient Egyptians had a practice that seems bizarre until you really think about it: writing letters to deceased relatives. These weren't memorials or epitaphs, they were actual letters, written on pottery bowls or papyrus, addressing dead family members as though they could read them and respond. People would leave these letters in tombs or near burial sites, expecting their deceased loved ones to receive them. The letters usually involve requests for help or complaints about ongoing problems. One letter from around 2000 BCE was written by a man to his deceased wife, pleading with her to stop haunting him. Apparently, he was suffering from various misfortunes and believed his dead wife was causing them from beyond the grave. In the letter, he protests his innocence, insists he was a good husband who cared for her properly when she was alive, and asks her please to leave him alone now. It's a fascinating mix of grief, guilt, exasperation, and genuine belief that the dead could intervene in the lives of the living. Another letter to the dead was written by a woman whose household was experiencing problems. She writes to her deceased father-in-law, reminding him of how well she treated him when he was alive and asking him to help resolve disputes within the family. There's an implied bargain here, the idea that because she fulfilled her obligations to him during his life, he owes her assistance from the afterlife. It's transactional, but in a way that shows how ancient Egyptians conceived of death, not as an ending, but as a transition to a different state where relationships and obligations continued. These letters were never meant for archaeologists or historians. They were private communications between the living and the dead, expressing hopes, fears, and unresolved emotions. The writers genuinely believed their words would reach the intended recipients. And in a way, they were right, just not in the way they expected. We're reading these letters now, understanding something profound about how people processed grief and sought comfort in the belief that death didn't sever all connections. The intimacy of these letters is almost uncomfortable. We're witnessing people in their most vulnerable moments, reaching across the boundary between life and death, asking for help that may never come. That they trusted these words to pottery shards and papyrus, leaving them in tombs, shows a faith that feels both alien and deeply familiar. In the ancient city of Ugarit, in what's now Syria, archaeologists discovered an archive of cuneiform tablets from around 1200 BCE. Among them were business letters from merchants conducting trade across the Mediterranean. One merchant in particular seems to have been spectacularly unlucky, or possibly just a chronic complainer, because his correspondence reads like a litany of disasters mixed with passive-aggressive commentary. In one letter, he writes to a business associate complaining that a shipment of goods hasn't arrived. He notes, with what feels like barely contained irritation, that he's been waiting for months, and this delay is causing him considerable inconvenience. He then adds, almost as an afterthought, that pirates have been active in the area, which might explain the delay, but also could the associate please confirm whether the ship even departed in the first place? Another letter from this same collection involves a dispute over the quality of copper that was delivered. The recipient had ordered high-quality copper for making bronze, and what arrived was apparently inferior stuff. The complaint is detailed and specific, describing exactly what was wrong with the copper and demanding either a replacement or a refund. There's a sense of wounded professional pride here, the feeling that the merchant has been cheated and wants everyone to know it. What makes these letters fascinating is that they show us international commerce in the Bronze Age was complicated, risky, and frustrating in exactly the same ways modern business can be. Shipments got lost, quality didn't match expectations, partners weren't reliable, and people wrote angry letters about it, just like we send angry emails today. These merchants were operating in a world without instant communication, where a message might take weeks or months to reach its destination and a response even longer. Every transaction required trust, because you might send valuable goods across the sea and not know for half a year whether they arrived or whether you'd been paid. The letters reflect this anxiety, the constant worry that somewhere out there something was going wrong and you wouldn't find out until it was too late to fix it. The archive at Ugarit was preserved because the city was destroyed suddenly, probably by invaders or earthquakes or both, around 1200 BCE. The destruction was so complete and so sudden that the inhabitants had no time to evacuate or save their possessions. The cuneiform tablets were baked hard by the fires that consumed the city, which, ironically, preserved them perfectly. So, we have this snapshot of Bronze Age commerce frozen in place, including all the petty complaints and business disputes that would normally be lost to time.
Among the papyri discovered in Egypt are personal letters that deal with the matters of the heart, and some of them are messy in ways that feel utterly contemporary. There's a collection of letters from the 2nd century CE involving a family drama that apparently spiraled out of control. One letter is from a man named Apollonius to his friend, discussing the problem of his sister. Apparently, the sister had been married, but the marriage wasn't going well, and she wanted to come home. The family was debating whether to let her return or insist she stay with her husband. Apollonius writes that their mother is furious about the whole situation. The husband is sending threatening letters, and the sister herself is distraught. What should they do? The reply letter suggests letting the sister come home, but warns that this will likely lead to a complete breakdown in relations with the husband's family and possible legal consequences. There's a weariness in the tone, a sense that everyone involved knows this situation has no good resolution, and they're just trying to minimize the damage. What strikes me about these letters is how timeless the problems are. Family conflict, difficult marriages, mothers who are angry, friends trying to give advice about situations they can't really fix. The specific legal and social context is ancient Egyptian, but the emotional dynamics could be from any era. There are also straightforward love letters in the papyri collections, though these tend to be brief and formulaic. Ancient people weren't generally writing lengthy romantic declarations in their everyday correspondence, but there are exceptions. One letter from a husband to his wife who was away visiting family simply says he misses her terribly and wishes she would come home soon. The brevity makes it more affecting somehow. He's not trying to impress anyone. He just wants his wife back. The most poignant are the letters that reveal relationships we'd never otherwise know existed. Letters between siblings who clearly cared for each other deeply.
Letters from parents to children serving in the military, trying to maintain connection across vast distances. Letters between friends checking on each other's health and fortunes. These relationships left no monuments, no public records. They existed in private spaces, in the everyday affection and concern people had for each other, and they would have vanished completely if not for the accident of preservation. Among the cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia are school tasks, exercises written by students learning to read and write. But more interestingly, there are also letters between students and their families. And these letters reveal that student life in ancient Sumer was pretty much identical to student life today, at least in terms of the excuses and complaints. One tablet contains a letter from a student to his mother, asking her to send money. He explains that he needs to buy clothing because his is worn out, and also he needs funds for various school expenses. The tone is familiar to anyone who's ever been a student or had children in school. There's an attempt at justification mixed with a clear expectation that mom will come through with the cash. Another tablet has a student complaining to his father about how hard the school is and how mean the teachers are. He describes being beaten for making mistakes in his writing, which was apparently standard pedagogical practice in ancient Mesopotamia. The modern reader's sympathies are entirely with the student here, though the father's reply, if there was one, hasn't survived. There are also exercise tablets where students had to copy out standard letters and texts. One popular exercise was copying a letter supposedly from a father to his wayward son, telling him to stop wasting time and apply himself to his studies. The irony is that thousands of students copied this exact same lecture about not being lazy, turning it into a rote exercise that probably taught them nothing except how to form cuneiform characters. The content about working hard was undermined by the tedium of copying it out dozens of times. What these school texts show us is that education has always involved a certain amount of complaining, excuse-making, and negotiation between students and their families. The students of ancient Ur were not thinking about how their homework tablets might be viewed thousands of years in the future. They were thinking about getting through their assignments, avoiding punishment, and maybe convincing their parents to send money. Utterly normal concerns, utterly human. In the desert fortress of Masada, archaeologists found a letter that was never delivered. It was written during the siege of Masada, around 73 CE, when Jewish rebels were making their last stand against Roman forces. The letter was from a man to his brother, and it's heartbreaking in its normalcy. The writer mentions family matters, asks about relatives, sends greetings to specific people. He doesn't explicitly say that he's besieged in a fortress with no hope of survival, but the archaeologists who found it know that everyone in Masada died, either killed by the Romans or by their own hands to avoid capture. So this letter, with its casual family updates and greetings, was written by someone who probably knew he'd never see his brother again, but was maintaining the fiction of normal communication. What makes it unbearable is that ordinariness. If he'd written a dramatic farewell, a speech about freedom and resistance, it would be moving in an obvious way. But instead, he's writing about family business, as though there will be a future where these details matter. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was just the human need to maintain connection, even when connection is about to be severed permanently. The letter never left Masada. It was found with other documents in a chamber in the fortress. Presumably the siege ended before it could be sent, or maybe the means of sending it were cut off. So it sat there for nearly 2,000 years, this unsent message from a man to his brother, a voice reaching across time saying, I existed. I had a family. I cared about ordinary things, even at the end.
In Roman Egypt, there is a document known as the Petition of Dionysia, and it's remarkable because it's a woman telling her own story directly, without a male intermediary, which was extremely rare. Dionysia was a woman of some property who had been wronged in a property dispute. Rather than having a male relative present her case, she wrote her own petition to the Roman governor, laying out her grievances in detail. The document is long and surprisingly sophisticated in its legal arguments. Dionysa explains that she had been married twice, had children, and had managed to accumulate property through inheritance and her own efforts. Then various male relatives attempted to seize her property, claiming she had no right to it. She systematically refutes each of their claims, cites relevant laws, and demands justice. What's extraordinary is the voice. Dionysa is angry, but she's also controlled and articulate. She knows the law and uses it effectively. She presents herself as a respectable woman who has been treated unfairly and deserves better. There's no apologizing for taking up the governor's time, no false modesty. She states her case and expects it to be heard. We don't know the outcome of her petition. What we have is just her side of the story, preserved on papyrus. But the mere existence of the document is significant. It shows that at least some women in the Roman world could and did speak for themselves, assert their rights, and navigate legal systems. Dionysia's petition wasn't meant to be a historical document. It was meant to solve a practical problem, to get her property back. That it survives allows us to hear her voice directly, unfiltered by the male relatives who might otherwise have spoken for her in historical records.
Among the most mundane documents from the ancient world are shopping lists and household accounts, and they're weirdly compelling because they show us exactly what people were buying and consuming on a daily basis. There's a papyrus from Roman Egypt that's just a list of food items someone needed to purchase: bread, oil, vegetables, a bit of meat, some wine. Nothing exotic, nothing historically significant, just dinner. But when you read through multiple shopping lists and household accounts, patterns emerge. You see what was expensive and what was cheap. You notice that meat appears only occasionally in most households, suggesting it was a luxury. You see the seasonal variations in vegetable availability. You get a sense of what a normal diet actually looked like, as opposed to the fancy banquet menus described in literary sources. One particularly detailed household account from Egypt lists daily expenditures over several months. The person keeping the account notes every small purchase, down to the cost of lamp oil and salt. It reads like someone on a tight budget, trying to make sure they don't overspend. There are occasional splurges, a slightly nicer wine or some honey, but mostly it's careful, calculated spending on necessities. These documents weren't meant to survive. They were temporary records, probably discarded once the shopping was done or the accounts were settled. That they exist at all is pure chance, the result of Egypt's dry climate preserving papyrus that would rot away in damper conditions. And yet they tell us things that no grand historical narrative can convey. They tell us what ordinary life cost, what it tasted like, what people actually consumed, rather than what we imagined they consumed.
Marriage contracts from ancient Egypt and Greece reveal that ancient marriages involved extensive negotiations and legal protections, especially for women. These weren't romantic documents. They were legal agreements specifying what each party brought to the marriage, what would happen to property if the marriage ended, and what rights each spouse had. One marriage contract from Ptolemaic Egypt is between a woman named Apollonia and a man named Philiscus. The contract specifies that Apollonia brings a dowry of specific items and money. It then states that if Philiscus divorces her without cause, he must return the dowry and pay a penalty. If Apollonia divorces him, she gets her dowry back but pays no penalty. The contract also specifies that Philiscus cannot bring another wife or concubine into the household without Apollonia's consent. This is not how we typically imagine ancient marriages, where we assume women had no rights and were entirely under male control. But the contract shows that at least some women had significant legal protections. Apollonia's property was legally hers, not automatically her husband's. She had the right to divorce. she could prevent her husband from bringing other women into the marriage. These are real, enforceable protections. The contracts also show that marriages often involved family negotiations and financial calculations that had little to do with love or personal preference. Parents were arranging marriages that would benefit both families economically and socially. The contracts spell out exactly what each family is contributing and what they expect in return. It's businesslike and practical in a way that can seem cold to modern sensibilities, but it also meant that marriages had clear terms and expectations rather than being based on vague promises. These contracts weren't meant for us. They were meant for the families involved, to be consulted if disputes arose. That they survived allows us to see past romantic myths about the past and understand the practical, legal framework within which ancient people actually lived their lives.
In the royal archives of Mari, an ancient city in Mesopotamia, there's a letter from a minor official to the king complaining about his working conditions. This is remarkable because usually only the most important correspondence was preserved in royal archives. Letters from kings to each other, diplomatic negotiations, military orders, those made it into the official record. But somehow this complaint letter survived. The official is upset because he's been assigned to a remote posting with inadequate resources. He writes to the king explaining that he can't fulfill his duties properly because he doesn't have enough workers, the building he's supposed to maintain is falling apart, and nobody is listening to his requests for help. The tone walks a fine line between respectful and exasperated. He's not directly criticizing the king, but he is making it very clear that he's been set up to fail and it's not his fault. What's delightful about this letter is the bureaucratic frustration that comes through. This is a man trapped in a system where he's responsible for outcomes but doesn't control the resources he needs to achieve them. He's covering himself by putting his complaints in writing, making sure that when things go wrong, there's a record showing he warned people. It's a maneuver that would be familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large organization. We don't know if the king ever read this letter or if it made any difference. It ended up in an archive and stayed there until the city was destroyed and the tablets were baked into permanent records by the fires of conquest. But it shows us that even in absolute monarchies, there were bureaucrats trying to manage up, protecting their careers, and dealing with organizational dysfunction.
Among the inscriptions found at various temples and sacred sites are personal vows and thank offerings that people left for the gods. These weren't official dedications by kings or priests. They were from ordinary people thanking the gods for help or making promises in exchange for divine assistance. One inscription from a healing shrine in Greece is from a man who says he was cured of a chronic illness and is dedicating this offering in thanks. The detail he provides about his illness is almost clinical. He describes his symptoms, how long he suffered, what treatments he tried that didn't work. Then he came to this shrine, prayed to the god, and was healed. The gratitude in the inscription is palpable. Another inscription from a different shrine is from a woman who prayed for a child and eventually became pregnant. She's fulfilling a vow she made that if the god granted her request, she would make an offering at the shrine. The inscription is brief but emotional. You can sense the years of hoping and praying, the desperation that drove her to make the vow, and the overwhelming relief when it was answered. These vows were intensely personal religious expressions. The people who left them believed they had experienced direct divine intervention in their lives. Whether the healings and answered prayers were coincidence, placebo effect, or genuine miracles is beside the point. What matters is that these people believed, and their belief was strong enough that they made permanent records of it, paying for inscriptions that would last long after they were gone. The vows weren't meant for us to read. They were meant for the gods and for other worshippers at the shrines, as testimony that the god was active and responsive. But they allow us to understand ancient religion not as an abstract system of myths and rituals, but as a lived experience,
where people brought their deepest needs and fears to the gods, and sometimes felt heard.
And so here we are, at the end of this journey through other people's private correspondence, their shopping lists, their complaints, their prayers, their curses. None of these people ever imagined that thousands of years later, someone would be reading their words before falling asleep. They were writing for immediate, practical purposes: a birthday invitation, a request for socks, a complaint about stolen property, a prayer for healing. But in writing those words, in scratching them onto tablets and papyrus and pottery shards, they left traces of themselves that outlasted empires and civilizations. The kings they served are mostly forgotten now, their monuments crumbled or carted off to museums. But Claudia Severa's birthday invitation survives. Octavius's request for warm socks survives. Dionysia's legal petition survives. These ordinary voices speak clearly across millennia, reminding us that people have always been people, worried about the same small things, hoping for the same basic comforts, reaching out to each other across whatever distances separated them. You're connected to all of this, you know. Every time you send a message to a friend, every time you make a shopping list, every time you complain about something unfair or celebrate something good, you're participating in the same fundamentally human activities that people engaged in 3,000 years ago. The technology changes, the languages change, but the impulse to communicate, to connect, to leave some trace of ourselves, that never changes. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, know that you're part of this long, unbroken chain of human voices reaching across time and distance. Your words matter, even the mundane ones, even the ones that seem too small to count. They matter because they're yours, because they're real, because they're part of the ongoing conversation of being human. Good night, sweet dreams, and may your socks always be warm and your letters always reach their intended recipients.